Hello. There have been many classic Games Workshop boxed games over the years, Advanced Hero Quest, Man of War, Space Hulk, but it's hard to argue that the modern era of the Games Workshop boxed game really began in 2016, with the release of Warhammer Quest Silver Tower. My guest today, James Hewitt, designed that game for Games Workshop, as well as Horus Heresy, Betrayal at Calth, and Gorechosen. At Mantic, he worked on Hellboy and Dreadball, and for many other companies, he has worked on a great many other games. We talk about Resurrecting Warhammer Quest, the culture and ways of working in Games Workshop's design studio, what he's working on now at Warcradle in the Dystopian Age, and how to go about designing a game from scratch. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with James Hewitt. James, thank you so much for joining me. As ever, I would love to start by just exploring a little bit about how you got into the hobby. Where did you begin?
Yeah, sure. So I think people of a certain generation, it's the same answer I'd imagine a lot of the time, which is, well, it was Hero Quest. So I think I was 5, so I was probably far too young for it. And my dad picked it up for me. Thought it looked like something I'd enjoy, which weirdly, looking back, like I've never questioned that, but it was a kind of a weird thing because he's not particularly like into the nerdy stuff. He's not like, he likes cars. He loves cars. That's his big thing. And I wasn't particularly. And yet he saw this, and clearly something in his brain was like, "Oh, that's this child's future." And so, yeah, so he picked up Hero Quest and then refused to play it with me ever because it was way more complicated than he wanted it to be. Yeah, I mean, for me, that became like a bit of an escape. Like, I've still got that copy on my shelf, and it's still full of, young James scribbles, and the pieces were all looted for other games and all sorts of things, as is always the way. But yeah, I got into Hero Quest. Space Crusade came along, and then after that, when I was about 8 or 9, I saw someone at school with a copy of White Dwarf, and I was like, I recognize those Space Marines on the front cover, and there you go. It went from there. And yeah, it's sort of, I think in those years, I was the kind of fairly, I mean, this will surprise anyone, I was the quite nerdy, shy kid at school. And so that gave me like a little ready-made social group, bunch of friends who are, we'd go and hang around each other's houses and, play games. And it was, it just kind of became a lifestyle, as I think it does for a lot of people. And I never really stopped. Some people kind of, falter and go away from it and come back. But it's always been fairly constant for me. Even like I went to university and stayed. I was in the gaming groups there and that. So yeah, it's always been part of my life, really.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, do you remember any of the armies you were collecting, the games you were playing during that time?
Yeah, so I was I was never a child that could afford like I'm going to get a new army every month or anything. It was so I had my first love was my orcs. I had an orc army for a long time, and this was. I mean, the first set I got was the old second edition boxed set with the Blood Angels and the Orcs in it. And I have such vivid memories of sitting in the back of my dad's car, Queen's Greatest Hits playing on the tape deck, as I pulled the cellophane off and I opened it up. And there's that initial waft, the heady mix of cardboard, plastic sprues and cellophane that is, mold release agent that's probably poisoning us all very slowly. But yeah, and so that was the start of an orc army that I then kept for a long time. I got into Imperial Guard quite heavily. When the Praetorians came out, the metal ones, which are the Mordians with the head swaps.
Right, sure.
After the what was the big games they displayed? Was it Big Tooth River? I think.
Right, yeah.
They converted a bunch of
helmets, and
that was it. Yeah, and they redid those as the Praetorians, and there was a White Dwarf battle report called Battle for Glazer's Creek, I want to say.
Right, that sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, it was when the Praetorians came out, you had a little farm. It was Zulu. You had a little farmstead, you had the Praetorians, and then a set of rules for wave upon wave of orcs kind of coming in, and and that just, for me, that was the hobby. That was amazing. I played that scenario with my mates so many times. um, and it was cool because what I liked with it was a scenario which it was a battle report in a White Dwarf, but they were like, right, we're not going to use the standard rules for things. Here's a bunch of wacky stuff we've come up with for like each battle, the Praetorians, anyone that died, you roll a dice to see if they're walking wounded or they're completely out of the game, whatever else. And it was kind of this eye-opening moment, I think, for me of, oh, you don't have to just play the way it's written. You can mess around with things, So yeah, that was my stuff. Although, I mean, I say that I still have got the first White Dwarf I ever got, like 183 or 184, I think it was, which remember they used to have the catalog pages in the back.
Sure, yeah.
I filled in the mail order form, not knowing what any of these things were. And I've got this like, my 8-year-old handwriting of an Eldar Falcon, I think, had just come out, and an Eldar Dreadnought because they seemed cool, and Codex Space Wolves. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll have that. Just complete like random set of stuff. Yeah, so I was always. I was never someone who I wasn't much of a butterfly in terms of different armies. I stuck to the ones that I kind of knew. And then like specialist games happened, and I got really heavy into Necromunda, Mordheim, and Battlefleet Gothic.
Right.
Were the three that I got big into. And also, and funnily enough, Warhammer Quest, which became relevant later.
Sure.
Because again, it felt like a very different way of doing it, right? A different way of playing with toy soldiers and your friends, but you're all on the same side and you're exploring a dungeon. That's really cool. So yeah, I think a variety of things really is probably the answer to that question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you mentioned that, looking at the sort of the scenario and it kind of presenting this alternate way to play, or kind of modifying the rules as written in the book.
Yeah.
Did that sort of, you sort of said that kind of open your eyes. Did that prompt the sort of starting of your journey into the design side of it?
I think so, definitely. I mean, let's say I think one of the things that I really enjoyed was the so we used to play Gorechosen quite a lot. Gorechosen was a game that we got quite into, and it's one that gets derided and slammed a lot. But if you were there, you were there. If you were there at that time, there were the games there when it came out. They had like half the hall chanting Gorka, half them chanting Morka. My mate Ollie won the raffle to get a signed copy of Gorka Morka on the day. We took it home and we played it like to death. And what we love with that was it had a real sense of again, like mash it up, do different things, customize everything. And we got into this idea of, well, why stop there? Let's make up new things, because they started putting like things in White Dwarf for additional rules, and we just started doing that. And I found my copy the other day and I pulled it open, and there's loads of handwritten pages of like, here's a set of rules for I think, what was it? Putting Eldar in Gorechosen. What if some Eldar turned up? Because one of our mates played Eldar. Here's some rules for that. Let's have things for them. And and I looking back at it now, it was just this like excitement of wanting to create stuff and have my mates play it and have a good time. And that I think really resonated with me for a few years. This sounds like a tangent, but bear with me. For a few years in my 20s, I was a DJ, did like sort of club DJing of an evening to pay the bills. And at one point where I was working in Games Workshop Kensington, running the shop there, and then I'd close up, drive from London to Reading, DJ till 3 a.m, drive back, and usually work the Tuesday as well, because it was London. You couldn't afford to live if you didn't have two sources of income. But the reason I bring it up is there's a real joy in doing a thing and then everyone loves it and has a great time. And when you're DJing occasionally, you put a certain song on, everyone gets really excited, and it's such a good feeling. And to me, I think that was the same sort of thing, as I was making my friends have a good time, and therefore they wanted to hang out and do things. And that's, a psychologist, I'm sure, would dig into that no end. But yeah, it certainly pulled me in.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. And I know we'll explore a little bit more about the design side of your work, but I mean, I'm just curious there about that. There's an immediacy, I imagine, when you're a DJ and you can see the impact that it's having as people are dancing in front of you and having a great time. I'm guessing you don't quite get the same thing as a games designer, because there's a distance to the actual people who are enjoying it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get a little bit of it like during like playtesting, for example. So when we're designing a game, testing it, you got people there, you're kind of getting immediate live feedback. And there is a lovely moment, usually a couple of weeks after you want it to happen in the process, but it's when it clicks into place. and suddenly the game is doing what you want it to do, and people are not kind of having to stumble over the rules, they're just having fun. And that is the same feeling, it's the same thing. But like you say, normally there's a bit more distance there, although there is the lovely joy of, like, occasionally I'll walk into a place and people are playing a game that I've worked on, and I've not gathered them around and said, hey, could you play this please? They're just doing it and they're enjoying it, and that never gets old. I was at Adepticon for the first time earlier this year. I got sent by Modifius to talk about Fallout factions. And on one of my lunch breaks, I went for a little wander and I found an Adeptus Titanicus campaign day going on. And that's a game that I'd worked on, what was that, 2017 or so? So, a fair few years ago. And seeing a whole room full of people playing this game, which I don't think it's fully supported anymore. Even I think Legions Imperialis has come out and it's kind of on the back burner. But they were having such a great time, and I just got to sort of walk around fairly anonymously and just watch this and see all the love that had gone into all these like campaign rules and the miniatures. And then someone was like, "Are you James?" I was like, "I am." We had a little chat about it, but for me, the joy of just kind of seeing that and seeing people having fun with the thing. My family are all musicians, so I use a lot of music analogies, but like, to me, game design is like writing sheet music, in that you are creating a thing which isn't finished until you give it to someone else. So in the same way, if I were to write a piece of music, until I give it to a musician and they perform it, it's not finished. Game design, the same thing. When I write a set of rules, it's not till they're in the player's hands on the tabletop, where hopefully I'm not, because that'd be weird if I was there every time. But it's not until there that it happens, and so I don't really get to see the finished product. So when I occasionally do, it's a lovely little surprise.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy, actually. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in that way before.
I think I've been saying that for a few years now. It just sort of popped into my head one day, and it's like, that's kind of it's the same sort of vibe, So yeah.
Yeah. So how did you then, you mentioned working at Games Workshop in the sort of retail space. How did you end up actually doing games design professionally?
It's the most clear and obvious career path, as anyone in this industry does. I'm sure you've spoken to a lot of people. We used to do a podcast. So myself and my partner Sophie did a podcast called Finding Games, where Sophie would talk to people about their journey into the games industry, mainly focusing on like board and card games. But you never had a straight career path. No one goes, I'm going to be a game designer, and then does three things that build towards being a game designer. So I was working in Games Workshop retail for about a decade, and I sort of moved around the southeast, various shops. We were mentioning before we filmed that we might have crossed paths in one of them at one point.
Yeah.
Which is quite exciting. But from there, I basically I'd made it known that I wanted to do game design, because one of the things I really enjoyed was I used to work in Games Workshop Reading for quite a long time, which had a big gaming room in a really big kind of community vibe, and we did a lot of in-store campaigns. So there was me and Andy Clark, who now writes a Black Library. Right. And it's one of the narrative writers. In fact, he worked on Silver Tower with me. We were the two full-timers in the shop at the time, and we used to run these amazing campaigns. And I, it was just this chance. It's summer, we've got 6 weeks. What crazy game mechanics can we bring in? When Lustria came out for Warhammer, we had a whole like treasure map kind of thing going on, where there was like a grid thing. Whenever you win games, you go to search for treasure on the map, and there was little coins you collect, all sorts of random stuff. And I'd wanted to get into like designing games for Games Workshop for quite a while. And I was working in the London region running shops, not having a great time. Like, retail hours suck anyway, especially if you're living in London. And if you're in London, if you've got time or money, you can have a good time, but we didn't really have either. And so we took a leap of faith and moved to Nottingham, because we had friends up here from, Games Workshop days and things. And we thought, what have you got to lose? I did a bunch of temping. But in that process, our old regional manager from GW had ended up working at Mantic. He was doing trade sales for them, and they said, we need someone to design a sci-fi sports game. And for whatever reason, he put my name forward, made introductions. And that led to me working on Dreadball, initially as a very sort of freelancey. I was working as a benefits assessor at the time. but then I worked on Dreadball with Jake Thornton. I'd pitched a game called Razordisk, which was like sci-fi deadly ultimate frisbee. Um, and then Jake came in with Dreadball, and some ideas carried over, and we worked on that for a bit, and then that hit Kickstarter and was rather popular. It was one of the first big UK board game Kickstarter, tabletop game Kickstarter campaigns. And as part of that, I was like all over the forums and Board Game Geek and the Kickstarter comments and everything, answering questions, hyping people up. Because I mean, you work in Games Workshop for a decade, you get good at just exciting people about games generally. And so Ronnie at Mantic said, "Hey, do you want to come do that for a living?" And so I did. So I went and became a community manager at Mantic. And that was like a foot in the door, you know. Because when you're working in a team that's fairly compact like that, even though my job was social media management, making videos, doing event stuff, I was in the room when all the kind of the design was happening, when discussions were being had with factories and all these different things. It gave me this quite broad knowledge. So then when it came around, there was a job going at Games Workshop. I put an application in to work on the design team, and I think having that experience really helped it. I think also what was really helpful was I went in knowing, well, I'm quite happily secure where I am. I don't need this job. I'm in the industry working on game stuff. It's pretty cool. But I'm going to go in and treat this as an opportunity to find out if this is a job that I want to do. And I think maybe that made me stand out a little bit, because there is this, oh my God, we're at Games Workshop, we're at head office. Oh my God, well, this is the room where the dreams happen. And don't get me wrong, I still have that to this day, but I'd kind of become a little bit immune to it by working in the industry already. So I was going just very like, "Oh, hi, it's a Tuesday. How you doing? I'm James," and we just started talking in a professional capacity about designing games. And I think that really helped get over the line. So yeah, and that was that. Worked in the Games Workshop studio for 3-4 years. It was just when Age of Sigmar was in development. So that was a really exciting time.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, what was the kind of, and I know you've spoken about this elsewhere online, but I'm just curious about your reflections on that, the vibes at that time, and whether or not you sort of looking back now a number of years later, kind of your sort of feeling about it has changed or evolved.
Yeah, I think the main thing has been what I've sort of said before in various interviews and things. I've had quite a lot of strong opinions about those times. Certainly before I was diagnosed with ADHD and therefore medicated, I had a lot of very loud opinions on Twitter a lot of the time. And I think the biggest lesson I think from that time to reflect on for me personally is, if you're working in a big kind of corporate run studio, which is operating to make a profit, and that's what it does, and it doesn't make any secret of that, and it says it in its mission statement, you can't get upset when it acts like a big corporate company, And the difficulty is when it's a company like Games Workshop or Marvel or Sony, any of these big companies, which, because GW, even though it's a small company, it's a big company these days, and it operates like one. You get these companies which they are kind of nerd founded, and there is this sense of it's us, it's our company, but actually also it's making a lot of money for a lot of people, and so they're going to run it a certain way. And I think it's quite easy to get caught up in the fact that it's meant to be this really fun thing, and it's meant to be a really cool thing. And you will work, like when I was there, I worked with incredible people, just the most amazingly talented, creative bunch of people. And that is all great, but at certain points, you'll become very aware, oh, yeah, but if that doesn't make a profit, you're screwed. And so I mean, Silver Tower is a great example. Silver Tower was a game that was, from the point of view of the business need was, we need to put out a box of miniatures, which are new miniatures. It's probably about £125 price point, I think it was. We need to put as much work into the game side of it that we can sell it as a game. And that's 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 the thing, because it fits that
Right.
niche of we need a game to go on a thing. That was as much as it needed to be, like commercially. For me as a designer, it's like, oh my god, it's Warhammer Quest. What do because it wasn't Warhammer Quest originally. It was like they weren't sure if they could use the Warhammer Quest title because of the app game. They weren't
Right.
sure if there was some kind of thing. But I was like, well, even if you don't call it Warhammer Quest, it's very clearly Warhammer Quest. And so my thing was, well, I have to do it right for teenage me and for all the other people who loved this game growing up. Even though there's all these constraints, I have to make it feel like Warhammer Quest. And so I bit off so much more than I should have been chewing, and ended up working all the crazy overtime that I could to get it to where it was. And definitely overreached in a few places. Like there's a few bits of the game kind of a little bit shonky and falls down, but I think came out with the thing that I was really proud of. Weirdly, it sort of mirrors the original Warhammer Quest because I got chatting to Andy Jones, who, wait, no, Andy Hall, Andy Jones,
Andy
Hall.
Jones, yeah.
Andy Jones, thank you. Okay, I mix those two up all the time for some reason. Andy Jones, I got chatting to Andy Jones after I'd worked on it, and I bumped into him in the photography studio at GW, and he introduced himself, and we just had a little chat back and forth about making a Warhammer Quest game. And the role play book in that game, the thing that everyone goes on and on about, was never part of the plan. He told me he did that in his lunch breaks, and because he wanted to make that. And I was like, okay, it's not just me then. And so the thing is, the product got made, so the box was ticked. I got my kind of make the thing that I want to make. The thing that paid for it was me in a weird way. Like, I put the extra effort in. I didn't get paid overtime. I didn't get a bonus for the game doing well. I didn't even get a copy of the game. I didn't buy my own copy of the game. But like, I was happy to do that because it meant that I got my name out on a thing. Not that I had my name on it, of course, but people knew that I'd done it, and I could sort of say, well, this is my contribution to that canon. Why would I not want to make it as good as I could make it? And I think anyone going into any sort of corporate creative environment, any sort of creative studio that is, managed and runs for a profit, I think the thing you have to remember is whenever you push yourself outside of like the standard limit of what they ask you to do or what is reasonable for them to ask you to do, have a good reason for doing that. Every game I worked on for them, all the box game things I'm super proud of, and all of them probably I put more work in than I was paid for, and it's easy to get annoyed about that. But also, I'm really happy that those things went out. And again, I've chatted to people who have loved a load of those games. Even like Gorechosen was like, I did it in 2 weeks, which is a mad amount of time for a game. That's nowhere near enough time to do a game like that. And yeah, I think if I hadn't done that, it would have been very forgettable. And I don't like the idea of making things forgettable. I want people to remember, even if they had a bad time doing it. I'd rather they had an emotional response of some kind.
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, I forget what the question was. But that's my rant about something.
Sure. I mean, I guess just thinking about those two games then. So what would obviously a short actual production timeline, but would you have been asked to pitch it? Are you told one day, okay, we need to do this, and you have to come back the next day with ideas, or are you doing ideas in the room? Sort of what's the actual process for Gorechosen and Silver Tower?
Some and some. So Silver Tower was a thing where the process at that time, I don't know how it is now. That's nearly a decade ago. The process at the time was the miniature studio makes a bunch of miniatures, and they do all their research and their concepting and all that kind of thing. And someone high up in the game design studio at the time, the Books and Box game studio that it's called, would be in on that chat. None of us designers, someone higher up would be on that chat, and they'd have opinions about what kind of thing it could be. And then once the miniatures are all finished, they would one day appear in our cabinet in the studios as a finished thing. And then we'd be told, right, you're making a game about these miniatures on this shelf. Off you go. The box games were generally a lot more freeform than the codexes and things. Like with the codex, it would be, here's the 5 new units that are going to be put in the new codex. Here is a book that's already been laid out with space for rules to go in. So you need to write 7 lines of rules for this thing and 2 lines of rules for that thing, whatever else. And a double page spread of army rules, whatever it might have been, 3 scenarios. Whereas the box games were much more of a you've got roughly this much budget to play with. You can probably get a deck of cards, a few dice, whatever. So with Silver Tower, like, it was, one day here are the miniatures. They're really cool. We're going to do a game. And a bunch of us went into a room and we sort of batted around ideas of what it could be. I think I had a couple of days to kind of scribble some notes down and prepare some thoughts. And I had this kind of crazy, like in my mind, there was the wall plastered with things, the red string going back and forth. But that wasn't actually what happened, but it feels like that was, here's a whole bunch of ideas. What if rather than doing a set bunch of missions, we do a choose your own adventure book, which happens to also be a tabletop game, and I mean the whole point with that was trying to thread the needle between the two kind of modes of play of Warhammer Quest of old, where you either had one person being the GM, which is cool, but they're kind of sitting out and they don't get to be part of the gang, or the completely random like card draw exploration stuff. And I kind of wanted to get a bit of both. And I thought, I think we can probably do this. And everyone was like, is that wise? I was like, I don't know, but let's do it. But yeah, it was really cool. We had like in that room, there was like me, there was Andy Clark, who I mentioned, a fellow called John Mickleback, who was the artist, did all the floor tiles. Tim Malloy, who's an amazing artist and graphic design. I think he currently works in archiving or something over there, doesn't he? Amazing knowledge of the IP. 3 or 4 other people. And that is such a cool room to be in, right? Like just going, what could this new Warhammer game be, and kind of throwing ideas around. So that was an amazing part of the process. Gorechosen was a lot more straightforward because it was part of it was the precursor to the current kind of gateway games range that happens. So you get the £40-ish goes into Target and a couple of stores in Germany. Blitz Bowl, that's a separate story. That was after I left the company. But you get like here's a Warhammer Quest spin-off. Here's Combat Arena. Here's whatever else. This was the precursor to that thing where it was the same kind of price point. It's basically a way of repackaging some miniatures, selling them to a fairly casual market and seeing what comes in. So that was more of a, hey, James, here are 4 Khorne characters. Make a gladiatorial game. You've got 2 weeks, off you go. And what was convenient was I'd been working on a gladiatorial combat game about 5 or 6 years previously, just in my spare time, because I thought it was a cool concept. And so I had a lot of thoughts about what makes a fun game in that regard. So like it's got to be it's got to be about movement. You can't just all cuddle in and roll dice until someone dies. You want to always be repositioning. So the thing in Gorechosen where I don't know, have you played Gorechosen?
It's not. I've not been able to get hold of a copy.
Oh no. So yeah, if you the main thing is it's a hex grid. You're playing cards from your hand to do different moves, attacks, and things. And every card I think has a move, an attack, and a something else. And so you pick how you play it. So there's a bit of resource management going on. But the main sort of crux of the game is that every character has got a different threat zone. So there's one who's got a pair of axes who can attack the hexes, 3 hexes in front. There's one who's got a really big choppy thing who attacks like a straight line in front of him. There's one with a swingy anvil who doesn't attack an adjacent hex but attacks a hex away. And so what you have is this game where you are constantly moving and dancing, trying to put yourself in your opponent's blind spot and hitting them. And that was a thing I'd worked on for a game, let's say I've been doing a few years previously. It's like, well, that needs to be in there because that makes it a really compelling combat game. And then it was a thing of like, I'll go into the little playtest room, roll some dice, try some things, and the idea just sort of fell out in that 2-week period. So whereas the Warhammer Quest Silver Tower thing was very like blue sky, oh, what could it be? This was like, oh, it's this, just make that.
Yeah. Do you see any kind of through line from Gorechosen to Underworld, say, and sort of how that's kind of evolved over time?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think when Underworld first came out, a lot of people were like, oh, it's Gorechosen. It's like, well, no, they're on hex grids. They're not the same game. But I think there's definitely some stuff that carries over there. So Dave Sanders, who designed Underworld in the first place, he took the job when I left to go into the specialist game studio. He sort of took that role in the rules team, and they really put him, because he's a massive board games, card games person. They put him onto the design of the box games things for a fair while, and that was kind of his baby. And I think there are elements like with you've got a hand of cards, you're doing things as a hex grid, there's combat, but to me, Underworlds feels more like there was an old game called Summoner Wars, done by Flat Hat Games, and it was a kind of PvP arena combat game with like you summon various monsters and things, and it has the feel of that. It's like it feels less of a casual pick up and play game, much more of a quite in depth head to head thing with the deck building. I love that there's deck building, and it's such a cool thing to bring into that space. So yeah, but I think it's always interesting, especially with like Games Workshop games where you've got like one studio putting all these things out. You can always see the through line, the DNA. Where I mean, you can go back. There's a video here, right? If you haven't done it already, there's something like go back and look at the Rick Priestley, Richard Halliwell, and there's probably two or three others, Jervis. Like they made these really sort of formative games back in the day, and where has the DNA of those games gone? And I think there's a lot that could be identified. I certainly see it in my own work. I look at things that I've done and I go, oh, hang on, that's just that with a different hat on.
Sure. Yeah, I think that family tree would be really interesting to sort of build out, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as you say, Warhammer Quest and Silver Tower picking up the spirit of the original and making it something new, bringing it into the Age of Sigmar and using these amazing new miniatures. I think you did a phenomenal job with Silver Tower, and
thank you.
I think you can definitely see all of that extra love and care and attention, much as you can with Andy Jones's roleplay book. The reason it's still mentioned and talked about now is because the extra work was put in.
I think you can tell when a thing's been made with love, right? You can tell when someone's made
absolutely, completely. And I wonder if perhaps Silver Tower hadn't been such a success, hadn't had that extra bake time from yourself, if you like, then would it have re-established the Warhammer Quest line in quite the way it did? Because it obviously set the stage for sequels.
Yeah, it's a question that I ask myself a lot. So I struggle with imposter syndrome, as any creative person does, and I always say to people I work with, if I ever stop doubting myself, I'm doing it wrong. It keeps you keen. But I know that, so the games that I worked on in that studio, so it was Horus Heresy Betrayal at Calth was the first one. Silver Tower, Gorechosen, and am I forgetting one? It might have been those. But whatever the case, they were all really well received. And as a result of that, we started seeing more boxed games in coming out of the main studio. And I feel like if I hadn't pushed as hard as I did, I don't know if we would have seen the resurgence in box games, but it feels really kind of conceited for me to say, well, of course it was down to me all along. I was the one that, but there definitely was like this sudden push towards, oh, hang on, box games can be good. Because like, there'd been a bit of a, as I say, it was very product led. Like, oh, we need a game which is, it's a £50 price point. It needs to exist as a game. We need to just write it so that it technically is a game. And there was this, clearly a lot of the time it was just written that, and it was written very quickly to just function. And you'd probably play it once and then forget about it, whereas I was so driven by this thing of I want to make good games. It's the thing that kind of makes my soul sing. I want people to have fun with these games and come back to them. And I think, I feel like there was definitely something in that which then led into, because I mean, prior to that, I mean, the last foray into like board games was like the Space Hulk and Dreadfleet 2-year run, and then nothing after that for a very long time. So if nothing else, I feel like I was there when it all came back, and that's a lovely feeling.
And I think that they are certainly, for me especially, but I think more generally, Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, I think, does stand alongside the original Warhammer Quest as a classic, it's a classic Games Workshop boxed game.
That's lovely to hear. Thank you. It's what's been really nice actually is, I mean, I've not played any of the follow-ups, but again, simply because I've not had time or budget generally when they've come out. But it was really interesting. So Hammerhall, Shadows over Hammerhall,
Shadows over Hammerhall. Yeah.
There you go. That was Jervis doing that one, which was so weird because a lot of the stuff in Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, there was obviously influences from Warhammer Quest, but also from Advanced Hero Quest, which was a Jervis game, which then I got to I made that, and then he did his take on Silver Tower with that, which was a lovely, I've ended up working on loads of games that he's worked on over the years. It's like I'm stalking him, but in a professional capacity. But that I loved. Like, there were a few little tweaks he did to some of the rules. Like, there's a thing to do with when a character gets knocked out, it affects your dice. I think you lock a dice or something permanently. And there was just a few little things like, that's really clever. But that was always Jervis's. Working with Jervis was always about, he would take a thing that you're doing and he'd make one suggestion. It's like, oh, that's elevated it so much. And then Blackstone Fortress
Yes.
has then taken the ideas and developed them again, and now Cursed City. I really want to have a look at Cursed City. Maybe I might treat myself. I saw it on the shelf the other day in a shop, and I might go and pick a copy up and have a play, because it's like meeting the great grandchild, of a game
Sure.
that I knew. So yeah, it's lovely to see that legacy though.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, and you can see how it's evolved and it's changed.
Yeah.
There's obviously things that have flowed through from Silver Tower as things have been picked up again and brought back in from other games. But there's a lot of Silver Tower still in Cursed City, I think.
Yeah, I think, has it still got the kind of the roll dice and allocate them to things?
Yes, yeah, it's still got that going on, and a number of other things, but it definitely has. It feels like a continuation of that franchise, if you like.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's terrific. So, whilst you were at the studio, so you came in as Age of Sigmar was happening.
Yeah.
Did you feel any? Was there any sort of change in the sort of vibe and culture during your time there, from when you started to when you finished?
Yeah, I mean, it was in the middle of all that was when the community page launched.
Right.
So there was this sudden admittal that the internet exists, almost,
Right.
And it was interesting because suddenly you had this, big chunk of goodwill, I think, hitting at once. Like, we started doing videos. I remember there was a video for the Sylvaneth Battletome for Age of Sigmar, which I got pulled in to do. And it was weird because I'd worked on that as one of the last things in the main studio. I then got off on parental leave when our daughter was born. And in that time, there'd been a whole kind of shake-up of how battletomes work. And the big new thing with the Sylvaneth book was, now there's army rules that are specific to different, like, I don't know what the term they used was, but like the equivalent of different Space Marine chapters.
Right.
And so I was asked to come and record a video to talk about this. But the main thing they wanted me to talk about was stuff that I had nothing to do with and hadn't even had a chance to read up on. So I had to go and just do a load of like, what? Decode this battle in the 5 minutes before I went and recorded this video. But like that, we did like videos for Blood Bowl things, unboxed Blood Bowl, I think. There was a lot of stuff that was like experimental. It was just the early days of Warhammer TV. I did a couple of Warhammer TV things, like watching me and Rob Symes doing like a commentary on a Blood Bowl match and stuff that was being played. And it felt like this opening up to the wider world. It'd always been kind of sequestered in the ivory tower, and suddenly it's like, actually, no, maybe we can go out there and talk to the people that like the games. Maybe that's not a terrible idea. And yeah, it was, interesting. I mean, I also, in that time, we saw like the like Warhammer Fest became a thing. I always use Warhammer Fest as an example. If I'm working with writers, I'm like, never use a placeholder name for a thing, because I guarantee it'll stick. And I'm sure Warhammer Fest was written on a blackboard somewhere, on a whiteboard somewhere. Yeah, it's not Games Day, it's Warhammer Fest or something. And then that just became what it was called. But like, there was this kind of drive to go and engage in a different way with customers. I think that's kind of carried on and evolved since then. But it was nice to, be let out of the cages occasionally and go and talk to people and do things.
Sure, yeah. And then you sort of voluntarily left the cage, I suppose, in a way, because you left Games Workshop and went on to found your own design consultancy, Needy Cat Games.
It was fantastic. It was a big leap. It was the thing that I'd always wanted to do, and I was increasingly sort of frustrated with the fact that, again, like, I was coming to terms with the fact that I was making games, but I was not making the games I necessarily wanted to make or in the way I wanted to make them, because at the end of the day, you're answering a business need rather than making a thing for the love of making the thing. And to be fair, that has always been the case in my career since, but I've always made an effort to put myself in positions where I have more control over what it is. And the thing is, I don't mind doing the thing that needs to happen. I get frustrated when I feel like there's a better way that it could be done, but no one's listening because you're several rungs down the ladder, So with Necromunda, for example, when Necromunda first came out, there were several different opinions on what it should be. It should be a self-contained box game that can go into a trade stockist and sell. It should be Necromunda, the best Necromunda it can be, it should kind of be a bit like Rogue Trader and hark back to the olden days. It should be this, it should be this, it should be this. It should work on 2D. No, it should work on 3D. It was trying to be 17 different things at once, and it just frustrated me. And like, we didn't have much time to work on it, and there were all these kind of big level changes coming in at the last minute. And then very sadly, Alan Bly passed away, who was Forge World lead writer, who I didn't know him for a long time, but we worked in an office, sat 2 desks away, and absolutely lovely chap, and passed away at 43. And it was a bit of a wake-up call, of like, if I want to do a thing with my life, I should probably go and do it. And yeah, I've cheekily said it before, the fact that I wasn't being paid much made it really easy to kind of go, because it's like, well, I could go and get a job in a supermarket and be paid the same as what I'm being paid here. So I'm not putting, my young family at risk by taking a leap of faith. And so that was 2017. In fact, it was July. So it's now the somethingth anniversary. What's that? 8 years, 9 years?
Right.
Something. I don't know. Where are we now? 2024.
2024.
So 7 years. There we go.
7 years.
I don't do maths for a living. It's fine. But yeah, and that was like that was a real kind of push off into the unknown, because how do you do this? How do you go out and make games professionally as a solo thing? And I didn't really know what it was going to be at first. What it turned into was freelance game design for existing publishers, and that was, I think, it's what it always should have been from the start, because it's the easiest way to kind of do these projects. We had a couple of attempts at launching Kickstarters. Unfortunately, you then have to do a lot of things that aren't game design. You have to do like logistics and shipping and manufacturing, all sorts of horrible things. It's much better to find someone who's good at those things and work with that person rather than try to do it all yourself. But yeah, Needy Cat was I'm really proud of a lot of the things we did. COVID kind of took it around the back and shot it, unfortunately, to put it bluntly, right. Which is very sad. And it was, a difficult time. I think any small business struggled. We had a lot of constraint come in terms of time and space. Like making games is difficult to do in a cramped environment, especially when you're also trying to like look after a small child and all this. And so, yeah, things all kind of fell behind, which is how I ended up working at Modifius, because they were like, hey, do you want to come and get paid every month and not have to chase invoices? It's like, that sounds great. Yes, please, I'll do that. Yeah, and so Needy Cat is kind of in a sort of a hiatus at the moment. It's like, people say, oh, is it gone? It's like, well, not really, because it doesn't really exist. It's a logo that goes on things that I design as a freelancer, so it's still there. But it's certainly not the focus anymore. But while we did it, we had some really good fun. We made a lot of really fun games. Hellboy, which is kind of a spiritual successor to Silver Tower in a lot of ways. Devil May Cry, Sea of Thieves, quite a lot of stuff. It was all licensed. Most of it was licensed stuff. But I suppose when you've worked on something like, Games Workshop games, where it is all a coherent IP, your skill set is working within a pre-established universe. And so that was what people wanted us to do. We had so many requests for sports games and dungeon crawlers. That was all it was. Right. It makes the sport game dungeon crawler. You're the Warhammer Quest / Blood Bowl people. So yeah, that was a fun few years, certainly.
I mean, I appreciate you might not be able to talk about specifics, but
yeah,
just in general, what was that kind of development process like? I mean, is that similar to what you were seeing at Games Workshop, where you need to design something to some very specific business briefs, or is it?
I mean, yeah, it's a thing that we put a lot of work into a process for it, which interestingly then kind of became like, we did the Needy Cat online game design course, which we taught that to people. We then used it as the basis for how Modifius worked, and now, spoilers, we're now at Warcradle, and we're doing the same thing there. We're kind of putting these processes in place, because when you're trying to design games commercially, it really helps to have a framework. And so part of that process, that first couple of years of Needy Cat, was figuring out, how do you do this, especially when you're not in necessarily that, you're not working with the same people every month. You've got different clients, you're spinning lots of different plates. how do you establish like a vocabulary for how far along a project is? How do you tell people what the steps are? Because if you're working with a client, it really helps if they know what the process is, so they don't expect things when they're not going to be happening. And especially with like license things, where usually we'd be working with a client who's working with a license holder. So with Mantic, for example, with Hellboy, we had no direct contact with Mike Mignola or Dark Horse. We dealt with Mantic, who dealt with them. So there was this kind of long chain. So anything that we thought of and wanted to put into the game, that went to Mantic, and they take it to Dark Horse, and they check in with Mike Mignola, and there's this kind of telephone game thing going on. And then when you look at things like the manufacturing process as well, that the manufacturers would check a thing with us, you check it with Mantic, and the biggest challenge was trying to keep everyone on the same page and trying to not let things slip through the cracks. Because when you got that many levels of communication, it gets tricky. But I think the benefit is we got good at it, just through necessity, really. And it was nice that we got to work with so many different people, because every project was different. Sometimes you have things where it's very, very strict. You have to be exactly these things. Go and do this. And that was what we'd call like a bread and butter project, which is we do this to pay the bills, and we just do it, and it's done. And other ones, it's like, let's say with Hellboy, where we had loads of input. I mean, the Mantic folks, we've known them for years. Their office is like 5 minutes down the road from us. My mum lives like 3 doors down from Mantic practically. So we I'd pop over there and go in, and we have these lovely meetings and go, oh, what could Hellboy be, and all this sort of stuff. And so yeah, it varied massively, but really we came out of it with a very clear idea of what are the steps to making a commercial game product, especially a licensed one, or one that works within an existing IP, and that's been very useful since then.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like like you say, the sort of formalizing of that process can really help to take people on the journey, but also help you step through it much quicker, I guess. Is it more efficient?
Yeah, and it helps you understand things. So, for example, so if here we go. Here's a couple of things. So, the biggest lesson initially is that game design and rules writing are two different things. And when people first start making games, it's a mistake they often make. They'll sit down at their computer and they'll start writing a rulebook, because that's how you start a game. You have to put the rules into a rulebook. Otherwise, what's that? And it's the same thing as like when someone starts writing a novel for the first time. They will approach, if all they've ever done is read books that they've bought in a shop, they will try to replicate that, whereas actually that is the product of a writer doing loads of stuff, then an editor coming in and like you wouldn't start writing a book by trying to draw the cover art, and so you don't start designing a game by writing a rule book. What you do is we split it into process. So we start off with like a research period where we go, right, what is the thing we're trying to make? What else is out there? What's the IP? What's the theme? Whatever. Massive deep dive. Then we go into what we call a test build, which is just real scrappy little ideas. So if I was making like a dungeon crawler, it might be like, right, what's the exploration mechanic? And there'll be like 3 or 4 different ideas, and I'll scribble them all down and immediately go to the table and start like, okay, is it a card draw? And I will have, like, we've got boxes full of random components. It's like, oh, there's probably a deck of cards. So I'll put a deck of cards there. So I'm going to draw a card, and I'm drawing a card, and the card is blank, or it's just a playing card. But I'm going through the motion of, okay, draw the card, and then what else in the card? Okay, I place the thing. How does that feel? I roll some dice. And so you're kind of getting a feel for the physicality of the game and just the experience. And all of that builds towards trying to make what we call a vertical slice, which is like a 5-minute chunk of gameplay. So we start in the middle of the game. We don't worry about setup. We don't worry about army lists or whatever it might be. We go, right, on my turn, what do I do in the middle of the game? And then from there, once you've got that, it's like baking a cake. You slowly incorporate inwards. So you go, right, now, what does a round look like? What does setup look like? What's the objective? And so we consider that's game design. And then once you've kind of got that core engine, you then develop that. So we consider there's a handover between design and development. Development is taking that core engine and refining it or expanding on it. So you might, if it was like a war game, that might be where you bring in additional factions or scenarios, that sort of thing. And then from there, once that's done, then you can write a rule book. and it's the biggest lesson, I think, for a lot of new designers is you can't start with a rule book. we used to do a lot of consultancy. Like people would come in, we'd review their rule books and things. And the first question I was asked was, have you played this game yet? And it's remarkable how often the answer is no, because people think that rules exist as a written medium. But it's like I was saying earlier, right? It's like sheet music. You couldn't sit down unless you're very, very gifted. You're not just going to sit down and write a piece of music. You'll have an instrument with you. You'll be trying it out. You'll be trying different things. It's a process. If you divorce the design from the tabletop, you're not making a tabletop game. You're making a written piece about a tabletop game. and and I think it's one of the things that was a big challenge over COVID was people lost the ability to playtest in person, and you can really tell that there are games like board games that came out around those years, and I go, oh, that was only ever tested on Tabletop Simulator. That never got a real kicking at the table with people sat around it, because I'm sat here and there's a card 2 feet away from me with 8-point text on it, and the game expects me to be able to just look at that whenever I want to and read what's on it. And I can't pick the card up because there's stuff on it as well. And it's, if I was online in Tabletop Simulator, I'd hold my mouse over it, hit the Alt key, and it pops up and I can see it, But yeah, so I think so that the big thing is like teaching that process. And I find that teaching that to people we work with and work for and whatever else, it just helps people understand that, because they'll know that they can't expect to see a written rulebook until the end of the process, And yeah, I think that's been the biggest lesson for the past few years, really, is how does a game get made?
Sure. I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating. I mean, one thing I guess I'm curious about there as well is you talked earlier on about the sort of almost the sense of the narrative and the sort of emergent kind of story that comes from a game. I mean, are you able to account for that in game design, or is that just something that you have to hope
definitely
happens?
I think you can. So there are types of narrative in games. You've got scripted and emergent, like your two big sort of diverging paths, right? So you've got scripted narrative is, like a game like Silver Tower, where you've got the cards which direct you to passages, and a talented writer has written these pieces of text, and it's, it brings you in, it evokes things. But that's only one half of it, because actually the emergent story, the stuff that just happens as a result of what happens on the table, that is the stuff you really remember, I think. When I was doing Silver Tower, one of the big things I did was a load of research into loads of forums. What did people like about Warhammer Quest? And no one ever said they liked the way the passages were written in the adventure book. No one said they really liked the dice mechanics. What they talked about was, that time that a snotling killed my level 7 barbarian, or the time we rolled really, really badly on the events table and a bloodthirster turned up, or whatever it might have been. And those moments that happen at the table they're bottled lightning. You can't plan for them. You certainly can't put them in. Like, players will feel when you've tried to force that stuff into the game. What you can do is design in a way that encourages it. And the only way you find that out is by testing, and testing as much as you can and getting as many people to play it. And you home in, you go, oh, actually that thing, that causes a good little ripple of excitement in the room. Let's lean into that. Let's make more of that thing happen. And again, that's why playtesting in person is so important, because you're looking at body language, you're looking at the players' responses, and trying to figure out what things make them tick. And again, that's why things like diversity in playtesting, trying to get as many different people from as many different backgrounds as possible in, so that you can make sure you're not just catering to one type of gamer. And yeah, it's a huge thing. I spend far too much of my time every day thinking about this sort of stuff, but I love it.
I mean, I'm curious about, you hear about writers or musicians who they'll just walk in the street and they'll come up with a note or whatever it might be, an idea, a paragraph. Are you doing that just when you're out and about? You come up with a cool rule or gameplay loop and you're like, oh, that's going in the book. I'll find a game for that.
Smartphones changed my life. I've still got like piles upon piles of old notebooks from when I'd be out. I used to do quite a bit of driving for work. So when I worked in Games Workshop, I was one of the few people in the area with a car, for whatever reason. So I used to go and do a lot of like, oh, James, go cover the Swindon store for a day. Okay. And it'd be when I was driving, I'd get an idea, because my brain's just engaged enough that it can like freewheel a little bit. And I'd often end up pulling over to a services, grabbing a notepad and scribbling an idea down because it occurred to me. Sophie has always said that I see life through a game lens. So I sort of I'll be doing something else and go, oh, that would be a really interesting mechanic. That's an interesting system for this. Oh, that's really interesting. I read a thing. There was an economic modeling system. I forget what it was called. But it was a guy in the 60s made like a series of glass tubes that contained water that modeled an economic system.
Sure.
And I was like, that is fascinating. And I don't know. I've got a notepad somewhere with a bunch of ideas of how to make something like that into a game. Um, and it's yeah. And so I've always kind of had that. But at the same time, one of my big beliefs is that ideas are inherently utterly worthless. Like an idea is a great thing to have, but it's a starting point. Until you take that idea like to the anvil and hammer it, you don't know if it's going to be utterly rubbish. Um, and there's nothing worse than when I meet someone who will say, "Oh, I've had a great idea for a game for the last decade, and one day I'll do it." It's like, don't have an idea for a decade. Have an idea, try it out, and find out if it's worth having for a decade, because it might be the biggest letdown ever if you try it after 10 years and realize it's no good. And I mean, 90% of the ideas I come up with are terrible, but the whole point is that you work away and you build the instincts of what is good and what is bad. Yeah. You have to push past that failure. That the failure and the making a bad thing is such a part of the process. You have to just get used to it. So like with so we've been working for Warcradle for the past month and a bit. They have asked us to kind of come and set up an in-house studio to help continue developing the games that they've been working on and bring some new ones in. And we've got some new writers in the team who we've hired, new writers slash designers. And one of the things that we keep sort of focusing on as a lesson is don't try to make it good first time. Write stuff, get it out there, and then we will collaborate in the team. We'll pass it around. We'll give feedback. We will work with each other. And you need to kind of let go of the ego. And they've done a brilliant job. They've already they're on board with it. It's a delight, because you have to drop any idea that you're this like genius game designer. You're going to do some things and put some stuff on the table, and it'll one time out of 20 it'll be great. The other 19 it's going to be rubbish, and then you're going to work at it and it'll get good. And I think that's the skill is recognizing that and being willing to put yourself out there and make those mistakes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think if I had a boss who was going to tell me that the right thing to do was to make mistakes, at least to start with, that's quite a nice way to approach it, I think.
Yeah, and we do it very much on a level like, anything I write, I pass around the team. I say, hey, give me feedback, give me stuff, and it's nice because the first couple of times it's like, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it's like, no, tell me the thing, because I know that it's not right. So tell me how it can be better. Give me that. And it's that you build that trust over time, and you build it. And we've had it with people we worked with before, where over time you gradually start just getting a feel for each other's feedback. And like, so Sophie and I, who have worked together as writers, designers, and things for the better part of a decade, our feedback to each other is so succinct that it looks like we're like slinging mud at each other almost. It's like, no, that's wrong because of this. That's okay. That's that. And it's like a shorthand. Also, I mean, we've known each other for nearly 20 years now, so we have a shorthand anyway. And so we always have to warn people we work with. It looks like we are just having a proper slanging match, but no, we're actually working very efficiently and reaching that point which with the rest of the team, we have to take our time a little bit more with. But I think collaborative design is one of the greatest joys in life. Working with other people and bouncing ideas around and coming up with things that feel, innovative and unique and new, and then trying them and finding out this works. This is good because you've all brought things into it. There's nothing like it.
Hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned this is a new team that you're putting together at Warcradle, responsible for the Dystopian Age and obviously sort of continuing some of that stuff, like building out those franchises. I mean, are you able to talk about like what was the initiative? Why were you guys brought in? What was the intention there?
So the MD at Warcradle, a guy called Stu, who we've known for a long time. He was a Games Workshop manager with us back in London in the olden days. He used to be quite involved in Tempest Fugitives, which was a group used to do these amazing campaign events. Used to run at Warhammer World, then that stopped being a thing. They started running them elsewhere. He's got this amazing like brain for games and ideas and stuff. And so up to this point, he's kind of been spearheading the development on Dystopian Wars and Wild West Exodus, which are the two games that they've kind of got out there. But he's also the MD of a company, so he doesn't have time to do that sort of thing, on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, basically, we've gone in to create a game design studio. They've already got this incredible like plastics sculpting, plastics and resin sculpting, manufacturing, everything on house in-house like studio. Which puts out some really cool kits. I was building some of the Dystopian Wars plastics the other day, and they are really, really nice kits. But now we're coming in to do the other half of it and do the game design stuff. And so we've got there's Armored Clash, which is just on its way out very soon, which is 10mm scale alternate history Victoriana historical battles. It's the land equivalent of Dystopian Wars, but a different scale. Dystopian Wars it's much, 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 much bigger in scale. So I think I'd have to check, but I think Dystopian Wars is probably less than 1 mil scale if it were people. The ships are huge.
Sure.
This is now 10 mil, so the infantry are quite nice. It's a lovely size actually. So you compare it to like the GW Epic stuff. The tanks are a bit chunkier. Everything's a little bit bigger. It's a nice size to do. I mean, I was there when we were figuring out the scale for Titanicus, and 8 mil worked for that because you have Titans. Whereas here there are no Titans. You've got land ships which are pretty like massive, but you can, that 10 mil is a really lovely scale to work at. So we're doing Armored Clash, which is coming out very soon. That's been like we were able to sneakily do a bit of work in our free time on that before it went to print to kind of give it a bit of a a polish. Like the game was written, we've just kind of come in and tried to up the presentation of the rule book, make it easy to learn, smooth out some of the areas, do a load of playtesting. But we've got loads of stuff planned. We're doing at some point, and this might be an exclusive, but I was told I can say it, new editions of Dystopian Wars and Wild West Exodus. So we'll be applying all the stuff we've kind of done with Armored Clash to those, making them, even easier to get into, rewrite the rule books to make, a bit more, just like an easier read, maybe.
Right.
There's a lot of text in some of the rule books, but also we're pushing it out in different directions. So we've got a guy called Ed Spence who does a lot of like RPG streaming stuff. Really, really talented GM, really good writer. Is going to be heading up a Dystopian Age RPG, which I cannot wait to see.
Wow. Yeah.
And yeah, basically, the plan is those kind of three games: Dystopian Wars, Wild West Exodus, and Armored Clash, plus a raft of other board and card games. And it's a fairly open remit. We're really excited. We're being given quite a bit of freedom to innovate, and so yeah, it's going to be great.
That's really fun. Yeah. I mean, just for anybody who's not familiar with it, I mean, you mentioned it's sort of Victoriana, Steam Age, but the scale of it's enormous, right? These are huge war machines that are unlike anything that was ever really built and would even be possible, I imagine, right?
What's really interesting is, like, so Armored Clash, the rules set, because of the nature of the miniatures, you've kind of got a mashup of like Napoleonic infantry and cavalry kind of stuff happening. So you've got the Napoleonic war game, cavalry, infantry, artillery, kind of rock, paper, scissors thing going on. But also, like, in the, technology has moved on. So we've got almost like World War One era tanks as well, and that sort of thing. And then I say these huge like Mortal Engine style land ships, these huge like moving things, as well as like aircraft and all, Zeppelins and things. It's this wonderfully weird mashup, and it's such a fun setting. And you've got kind of there's like a massive global conflict between 8 different factions, and there are sub factions within those. It's a really rich setting, and like certainly with because it's all been so zoomed out, we're now trying to zoom in a little bit. So things like the RPG, whatever we end up doing with it, because we're kind of batting ideas around at this stage, but it's going to be really kind of focused in, and it will let you look at things through a certain lens. So the best kind of equivalent, I say, would be like when Dark Heresy came out, the 40k role-playing game. Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader, Death Watch. They were different games that all focused on a different element of that IP. So Dark Heresy was you're an inquisitorial retinue. Rogue Trader is you're the crew of a Rogue Trader ship, And by doing that, you can kind of really look into the dark underbelly of that world and get a real feel for it. So it's a very exciting time. We're having a great time with it.
Yeah, that's great. I
Yeah,
mean, just one thing that did make me interested there as well. But when you talked about, okay, we're going to do a new edition, we're going to make it
yeah.
more accessible because you've got some, like, there's a lot of information there, a lot of
Mm.
rules, whatever it might be. I guess that's another separate bit of design, right? So you talked about, like, the different aspects
Yeah,
of designing, but the actual teach of the rules
yeah,
or the sort of onboarding process. I mean, is that quite a difficult thing to break as well, to get
yeah.
right?
It's like the other day we were trying to really, really hone in on the wording for a set of rules about line of sight. And line of sight is my nemesis in games because the thing is, 9 times out of 10, it's really obvious whether a thing can see a thing. But you need that set of rules when it doesn't. Like, and what we want to like, can we just put in the rule book a QR code to a short GIF of me going, you know what it is, because the average gamer, the average person will just go, oh yeah, you can see that, that's fine. But you need to kind of cover off those weird little things. But the thing is, there's a like a paradox at the heart of every rule book, which is that a rule book is trying to do two things at once, possibly three. So it's got to be as you say, it's a teaching manual. It's a thing which tells people how to play the game and walks them through. So they read it and they need to understand the game. But also it's a rules reference. So while you're playing, you need to go back and read over it and find things nice and quickly to check rules. And on the third, like the optional is it also needs to sell the theme of the game. And that can get in the way of the other two. And so those two things, the first two, are in direct opposition because a teaching book needs to be very kind of like talkative and clear, but also plain English and introducing little things a step at a time. Whereas a reference wants to be very concise and clear, and it's technical writing at that point. And so Silver Tower is a great example. The Silver Tower rulebook does the teach very well, I think, and I'll say very well. I've got a lot of hindsight issues with that game, but like I think it aims to do the teach very well, which is you'll pick it up and you'll read at the table, and you don't have to do pre-prep. You built your models, you sit down and you learn the game as you play. Great, and it sells the theme fantastically. I mean, all the imagery and the artwork and everything else. You feel like you're in the Silver Tower. What it's terrible at is a reference. You go back and try to find a rule. Where was that? And recently we were playing Gloomhaven Jaws the Lion, which is a little dungeon crawly fun game, but it does a similar thing where it teaches like, oh, in mission 1 you learn about this, in mission 2 you learn about this, and so trying to remember the rules for a particular thing, you have to go, oh, which mission was that in, and go back, and there's no sensible order to it. So yeah, I mean, and so that kind of user experience design, I think, is probably the best way to put it, is a huge part of it. And I mean, even so, you could take a game like Titanicus, for example, which I think is a really solid rule set. But I look back at the text of the rule book and I cringe because it's so wordy. And you could take that, and without changing any of the game design, Necromunda is another great example. You could rewrite the rule book and make it a much better game, because just by presenting it differently, changing terminology, being more consistent, and all that sort of thing, you could make no changes to the actual gameplay, but change how it's presented, and suddenly it's a much easier game to learn. And that works wonders. It's such an important thing. I think people are getting better at it in the industry. I think there's more skill coming in, but the fact is, this is still a really young discipline. The art of designing games and writing rules is not a thing people have been doing for. Okay, no, let me clarify. People have been making games for a very long time, but making a shiny thing which you put on a shelf and then people buy it, and with no input from you, the designer, they have to learn a complex set of rules. We're still figuring that out, but doing things like putting processes in place, I think, really helps. And there's so much resource out there now for a new designer coming in. I would love to have had half the stuff. It's like someone coming in and learning to paint for the first time now, paint miniatures. There is so much out there that you can learn, to do. When I was starting, it was like, well, you've got to hope you know someone who knows how to paint miniatures, because otherwise, good luck to you.
Sure. Yeah, or you were doing the heavy metal. The first 5 you could follow, and then the jump to the 6th image was
draw the rest of the owl. It's exactly.
Well, James, I mean, it sounds like there's some amazing stuff going on at Warcradle, and there's a lot of exciting work underway that I think people can obviously be keeping an eye out for. I mean, is there anything that you would say is like the next thing, the coolest first thing out of the gate that you could talk about?
So, I mean, Armored Clash is on its way out very, very soon. I think it's coming out next month, depending on when this video goes out. I think it's August. It's landing, possibly September. I'm not entirely sure exactly, but I believe announcements have gone up talking about when it's coming out. So that's not so much. That's just me being misinformed if I've got the date wrong there, because I deal with this end of it, and then other people deal with the actual selling the thing at the end. But that's going to be really good fun. I think that's going to be a really nice. It's the products that are coming out for it, like the starter boxes and things. A lot of time and thought has gone out into making sure they're a really good like gateway into the hobby. So that's going to be really cool. There's also, I mean, not a Warcradle thing, but from Modiphius. So we were at Modiphius for a couple of years, and Fallout Factions, which is still nearly out. It's been nearly out for some time, but there have been loads of logistics issues. I was at Adepticon, which feels like a lifetime ago, demoing it, and it's still not quite here yet. But that's, I think, already as we speak now, it's being received in America, and it'll be out in the UK soon. But that's a really fun game. I'm really happy with that. I mean, I saw lots of people saying when Warcradle announced that we'd moved across there, they were like, I thought James was doing Factions. It's like, well, it was finished over a year ago. We spent a year then doing more stuff for it. There's so much to come. This is just the next thing we're doing. I say the ADHD is rampant. I can't stay in one place for too long. Although it does feel like now, like, with Warcradle, we've got this lovely open remit to do all sorts of exciting things. I think this might hold my attention for a fair few years. So quite excited to be here.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, I think we'll all be watching with bated breath to see what comes out.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, James. It's been a real pleasure. Such good fun to chat. So I appreciate it. Lovely
to come along and, actually be part of this. I've watched most of the videos anyway, so it's nice to be here. I won't watch this one. I can't watch myself back. But other than that, thank you so much.
Thanks, James. Thank you so much to James for joining me to talk about his career, his experiences at Games Workshop, and his work on some of my favourite modern games. If you would like to support the work that I do here on the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You will get early and exclusive access to content, interviews, my Discord, regular updates, and monthly giveaways for the rest of this year. I really appreciate any support that you can offer, and if you can share and like this video on YouTube, that is an enormous help as well. You can also listen to my interviews as a podcast, so just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you listen to your pods, and you should be able to find it. Thank you once again to James. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.